We are joined by Dr. Ali Atef, a researcher at the Egyptian Center for Strategic Studies from Cairo, and we're also joined by Mr. Khaled Dawood, a managing editor at Al-Ahram Weekly from Cairo. Good morning to both of you gentlemen, and welcome to In Depth. Let me here start with Dr. Atef. And what were the key messages conveyed in Trump's letter to Khamenei? And beyond the stated reasons, what unstated or implicit factors might be driving Khamenei's rejection of talks?
Good morning to you. In my opinion, the negotiations between the United States and Iran, I think, regarding the nuclear issue, are still viable. So far, the last letter sent by Trump to Iran through the international mediation, I think it sends a new message of hope regarding a potential of resume the negotiations between Iran and the United States. There are a lot of mediators between the two parties, whether regional mediators from the Middle East. There is Oman, and the United Arab Emirates is now acting as a mediator between Iran and the United States. And there are international mediators. Russia is playing an integral role regarding this mediation efforts, and I think also the Russian mediation sends a message of hope regarding resuming the negotiations between the two parties. I think we can be optimistic regarding these new negotiations between the United States and Iran, because both parties, Iran and the US, want to reach a settlement or a nuclear agreement. Despite of these statements, Iran and the United States want a comprehensive agreement to ensure each vision. Iran does not want to be pressured into the negotiations, and also the US administration wants an agreement with a certain draft that will not be accepted by Iran so far. And that's why we can call these negotiations or maneuvers between or altercations between the two parties, but the final best interest for both parties is reaching a nuclear agreement.
Right. Mr. Dawood, how has the U.S. withdrawal from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the nuclear deal that was signed, affect Khamenei's assessment of the reliability of future agreements with the U.S. and its skepticism towards the issue?
Well, good morning, and thanks for having me. Indeed, actually, you've touched upon the key obstacle in any possible negotiations between Iran and the United States, because the Iranian starting point is always that we've already had an agreement in 2015 that was backed by key world countries, all the members of the permanent members of the UN Security Council, and it actually went into effect until Mr. Trump came into office in early 2017. And 1 year later, he decided to pull out from this agreement. So the Iranian point of view is always that how can we guarantee that any agreement we reach with the United States is going to be respected and implemented on the long term and not changed whenever there is a new administration in office. But at the same time, I mean, there is another point or another way of looking at it, which is that, I mean, if an agreement is being or is possibly reached between the current U.S. administration led by Mr. Trump, who is known as a hardliner on Iran, and the Iranian leadership, that will probably be a sign of a kind of confidence that this agreement will last, because again, it's not being negotiated with a soft administration or an administration that has already open communication channels with Iran, but with Mr. Trump, who is actually also being pressured by Israel mainly in order to escalate the confrontation with the Iranian side. So again, I think we're still in a very initial stage. Mr. Trump is known for his desire to reach big deals, to sound like a peacemaker, as he's always repeated, whether on the Ukrainian-Russian conflict or on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And of course, the dispute with Iran is one of the most difficult issues to resolve, because the animosity between the Iranian Islamic Revolution and the United States dates back to the day the Islamic Revolution happened and after the occupation of the US Embassy in Tehran. So it's a long history of animosity, and to be able to reach a settlement that would reshape the Middle East region and the current situation would indeed be a difficult task. And as Dr. Atef mentioned, there are mediating parties who are hoping to build on Mr. Trump's desire to reach a deal with Iran, and at the same time try to calm the many suspicions and fears on the Iranian side that the issue is not only limited to the nuclear program, but also would include other limitations on its missile program, on its relationships in the region. So it's always a serious fear on the Iranian side that any negotiations would not be limited to the nuclear issue alone.
And there are also other parties who are involved in this issue, but we'll get back to that. Let me here go to Dr. Atef. And from your point of view, Dr. Atef, how does Khamenei view the potential impact of negotiations with the US on Iran's influence and security interests?
This is a very important point. In fact, that is the other elements to the potential nuclear agreement between the two parties, between Iran and the West in general. The second point, or actually there are 2 points regarding the nuclear negotiations between Iran and the US, which is the rocket issue of Iran that the US wants to incorporate in the next nuclear agreement, and also the military activities of Iran in the Middle East regarding supporting armed agents in the regions. There is no agreement between the two parties. It's a controversy that is ongoing and preventing a nuclear settlement between the two parties. And the nuclear issue is not the only problem between Iran and the US, but there is also the rocket issue and the military activities of Iran in the Middle East. This is a very important point that Iran refuses to negotiate. Iran rejects to negotiate the rocket issue and the military activities and supporting armed agents in the Middle East. And despite of all the military capabilities of Iran-supported agents that has declined after the past few years after the confrontation, for example, Hezbollah and the military hits by Israel launched on other armed supported agents, and these military militias are still acting actively. There are the Houthis in Yemen threatening navigation in the regional waters in the Middle East, especially in the Red Sea. And we have seen during the past year a huge decline in the trade, in the global trade percentage navigating through the Red Sea waters due to the Houthi attacks. Iran is still able to influence the Middle East. And it still has military capabilities in this region that has to be under negotiations with the United States, and these the items shall be incorporated into any nuclear agreement between the two parties.
Right. Mr. Dawood, getting back to you, and what role could a third-party mediator or play in the de-escalation of tensions, and would they facilitate dialogues between Iran and the US? And how about the influence of other parties in that?
Well, indeed, the role of mediators is going to be very important, considering that there are no direct negotiations are being held between the Iranians and the United States. And of course, it's well known that Russia has very special relationships with the Iranian regime. So that's why, I mean, again, as part of the détente that's happening between the new Trump administration and the Russian leadership, it was actually the Russians who revealed that when they met in Doha, when they met in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, they were the ones who raised the issue of the Iranian nuclear file and the need to make some progress towards the restoration of an agreement that would de-escalate the tensions that are already very high in the region. But in the same framework, I mean, again, the Trump administration and probably the entire regional powers are acting on the basis that the Iranian stand right now is not as strong as it was before the breakout of the war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. Because again, at the end of the day, after this war started more than 16 months ago, the impression was Iran is actually flexing its muscles and using all its proxies in Palestine, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Iraq. So basically, the Iranians proved that they have a major ability to pressure the key regional parties. But then, of course, after the major blows that the Israelis dealt to Hezbollah and the killing of the Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah, and then, of course, the situation with Gaza, Hamas being weakened to a great extent after all those months of war, and finally the fall of the Syrian regime led by former President Bashar Assad. This has basically caused major harm to the theory about Iran being the key regional power, and now maybe they are in a kind of weaker negotiating position, probably feeling that they need to give in concessions after all those changes that have happened over the past 16 months. But at the end of the day, I think knowing the Iranian style of negotiations and the history of conflict between Iran and the United States, the Iranians are very patient. They always depend on long term. They survived the first 4 years of President Trump, which actually witnessed a tremendous amount of sanctions, not just pulling out of the agreement, and the assassination of the leader of the Quds Force, part of the Revolutionary Guard, Mr. Qasem Soleimani. So, I mean, perhaps the Iranians are counting on the repeated announcement by Trump and his key officials that they would not start a new war, that he doesn't want to repeat any of the adventures that previous U.S. administrations have carried out by conducting wars in the Middle East. But at the same time, there are many other cards, mainly economic and military as well, that the United States can use to pressure the Iranians to give in concessions after the changing circumstances in the region.
Dr. Atef, how might a new nuclear agreement or a military strike affect Iran's domestic and foreign politics?
In my opinion, such hits or potentials to influence the Iranian nuclear program are still a controversy, because the nuclear Iranian sites are very heavily protected underground, and the US military capabilities to completely destroy the Iranian nuclear program are very questionable. The Iranian protected these sites for long years, which was stated by the Iranian president during the past period. And regarding the military, the US-Israeli military hits to be launched on Iran, I think these would lead to what we can call overthrowing the regime in Iran. They might only target the nuclear establishments, but they might also target the prominent figures in Iran. And consequently, these hits might change the dynamics in Tehran leading to an expected change to the political regime in Iran. So these military hits do not have only a military dimension, but will have an influence and a political impact on the regime in Iran. And this is another point targeted by the Israeli and the US, changing the dynamics of the Iranian regimes from the inside and not only externally. They are not only targeting the nuclear establishments, especially the two prominent sites. They are targeting changing the dynamics of the Iranian regime directly or indirectly. And this was pointed out by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu through the operations launched by Tel Aviv on Iran. He indicated that the change in Iran is coming. That's why I think that Israel and the US is using this card to change the Iranian regime from the inside through such military hits.
Right, Mr. Dawood, because we're running out of time, I need from you to understand what could be the broader goals the US is aiming for by disrupting Iran's energy sector, and would that be in the benefit of the US domestic oil industry?
Well, again, considering the dire economic situation in Iran, I mean, any further harm to the Iranian energy sector and mainly placing more restrictions on the export of Iranian oil will definitely very much harm the Iranian economy and the stability of the Iranian regime. So probably that will be one kind of aspect that the United States is going to be using all the time to put pressure on the Iranian regime, but also through pressure on its own allies, mainly China, which is one of the key countries that buy Iranian oil. So I guess that definitely that's going to be a very important card in the hand of the Trump
but how will that
to bring Iran to giving concessions?
How will that reflect on the whole world? Because of course, definitely that will have its own implication on the the oil markets worldwide, right?
To a certain extent. I mean, again, the amount of the Iranian exports is not that huge to affect the entire world economy, but certainly within the current economic conditions and the trade wars that President Trump is launching against even a very close ally in the European Union and Canada and Mexico, this would be another added pressure to the instability in the world economy. But again, it's a matter that aims at what Dr. Atef was pointing at, increasing internal dissatisfaction in Iran itself by making the economic situation worse, and maybe that would lead to a change in the Iranian regime, which is something the United States and its allies and of course Israel has worked on for many years, by causing internal dissent so that the Iranian people themselves would take the task of getting rid of this regime that has very kind of conflicting interests with the United States and Israel, as well as key Arab Gulf nations who also see Iran as a threat. So again, it will be very important to watch in the coming weeks and months whether the mediation efforts by the United Arab Emirates, by Russia, would bring the two sides closer and bring to Mr. Trump one of those kinds of deals he would love to have, because it would give him a lot of coverage on the world stage, as much as he tried to reach some sort of peace agreement with North Korea during his first term. So there is still some time before we can judge the effects of the Trump policy.
Indeed. There's still some time here. That was Dr. Alia Atef, a researcher at the Egyptian Center for Strategic Studies, and Mr. Khaled Dawood, a managing editor at Al Ahram Weekly. We thank you both, gentlemen, for your valuable insights.